Hi, everyone. We'll give people a couple minutes to get logged on and then we'll get started. Thanks for joining us. Well, let's get started with our conversation today. My name is Amanda Lyons. I'm the Executive Director of the Human Rights Center here at the University of Minnesota Law School. And together with Professor Martha Davis, we're going to be the moderators for the conversation today. And our focus in this conversation is going to be on how human rights can contribute to building forward fairer. So this event is co-hosted with the Roel Wallenberg Institute, the Northeastern University School of Law, the University of British Columbia School of Public Policy of Global Affairs, and the Human Rights Center. And this is actually the fourth webinar in a series that we've been hosting on COVID and human rights. These conversations are drawing from our book. I'm going to hold it up here. This is an edited collection that we put together with Morton Kiram, Martha Davis, and myself. And all four of our speakers today have contributed chapters to this collection. So it's really exciting to be able to have this conversation all together and continue the dialogue around this project. The first three webinars that we held covered a range of topics, and we're really going to be drawing on some of the diagnoses and analysis that came out in those conversations. The first discussion was on the vaccine rollout and different inequalities in that context and what human rights helps us understand in that space. The second looked at systemic inequalities and people living in particular situations of vulnerability. So I had a great conversation there. And the third that we had last month was looking specifically on economic, social, and cultural rights and connections to the global economy. These have been really vibrant conversations. We've been really glad to be able to have the conversations with authors to the book and additional commentators. So we have those conversations hosted. We'll share the link to those videos in case you want to go back and visit those or use them in your class. But today we're really excited to wrap up this series with this conversation thinking about what does human rights, a human rights-based lens, a different human rights approaches, what can that bring to conversations about transformative recovery from the pandemic? So we're really hoping to take the conversation forward looking and thinking about what we're seeing on the horizon. So the plan for today is to really have a conversational format, a discussion with our panelists today. Martha and I will get everybody started with a few questions to each of the speakers, but I'd really like to invite your questions. We'd ask that you put those into the Q&A function that you'll see at the bottom of your Zoom bar as opposed to the chat. So we'll take questions at any time through the Q&A function and make sure that we leave a good amount of time at the end of the session to have some exchange with all of you. So I will turn it over to Martha to get us started with some introductions of our speakers.
Great, thank you, Amanda. So we're, as Amanda said, we're so happy to have distinguished speakers today who are not only distinguished in their own right, but also contributors to the book. So it's great to be able to have a live conversation with them about the contributions that they've made. First, I'll introduce Martin Shanin, who is a British Academy Global Professor at the Bonavero Institute of Human Rights at the University of Oxford. Over more than 3 decades, he has worked both as an academic and a practitioner in the field of international human rights law. His work is driven by a quest for evidence-based assessment of both the harm or benefit to human rights and of the weight of any legitimate counterbalancing aims, such as national security or public health. The need for such he argues, a need for such holistic approach has been demonstrated during COVID-19 as human rights are on both sides of the equation. Next, we'll hear from Katarina Okaher, who is an associate professor of health law at the Faculty of Law, University of Copenhagen. Her research interests span health and human rights, focusing on how legislation can protect the public's health while respecting human rights. She is the principal investigator of PRONTO, which is a great acronym. I want to congratulate her on that, which examines restrictions on movement in response to COVID-19. And then we'll hear from Claudia Ituarte Lima, who is a senior researcher at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute and is also affiliated with Stockholm University and the University of British Columbia, one of our co-sponsors today. For 20 years, she has specialized in human rights, biodiversity, and climate law. As an international public lawyer and scholar who focuses on environmental justice and the transformation of international law into new governance forms that support healthy ecosystems and people's well-being. And then finally, we'll turn to Morten Karam, who's a director of the Raoul Wallenberg Institute of Human Rights and Humanitarian Law in Lund, Sweden, and adjunct professor at Aalborg University in Denmark. Morten was the first director of the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights. Throughout his career, he's had one foot in academia and the other in practical human rights work, transforming human rights norms and standards into realities on the ground. And Morten is our resident optimist, I might say. He maintains a forward-looking orientation, exploring new possibilities to strengthen human rights. So it'll be a great way to end our conversation today, I hope. The questions that we are focusing on today are, first, how can human rights contribute to building forward fairer? Not just building back better, but building forward fairer. Second, where is there hope for countering the non-democratic trends that have dominated global developments in the past decade and that have been accelerated by COVID-19? And then finally, what can the post-2015 agenda and the sustainable development goals contribute to this effort? So then now without further ado, I'll turn to Martin Shanin and ask you, Martin, in your recent paper and in your chapter in the COVID-19 book, you argue that the experience of COVID-19 calls for a change in the governance of epidemics and pandemics. In particular, you say human rights law, and human rights experts deserve a bigger role than has been the case in the past. And I wondered, could you elaborate on this and say more specifically what you believe would change with a bigger role for human rights in that context?
Thank you, Martha, and good afternoon, everybody, or whatever time zone you're in. Indeed, I believe that COVID-19 can prove to be transformative for building a better world, and also a world where human rights has a more prominent place. I am a great believer of an evidence-based approach to human rights compliance, and also think that we have now a unique chance to go that way. In our chapter with Helga Molbech-Stensig, my co-author in the book, we utilize a checklist model. What are the elements of a human rights compatible strategy against COVID-19? And if you read that checklist, it demonstrates quite nicely how all human rights are interdependent, indivisible, and if you want to comply with human rights in the fight against a pandemic, you have to look at all aspects of all human rights of all individuals. And in a short version, this means human rights are on both sides of the equation. How do you reconcile, for instance, the permissible limitations test in respect of, let's say, freedom of movement, freedom of assembly, with the positive obligations that flow from right to health and right to life? That's a difficult task, and many people would raise their hands and say human rights can't give anything because they contradict each other. But we claim the opposite, that human rights expertise, human rights assessment should have a greater role. What we see now, that we have a silo-based situation where different expertise comes with easy solutions. And I would claim that many of the epidemiologists, they apply their medieval or even older approaches without recognizing that there are value judgments inherent in those decisions. The reason why we are in such a mess currently in the West, in Europe, is that epidemiologists apply their centuries-old habits without allowing for an evidence-based assessment of what actually works and how we assess both the benefits and the harm created, for instance, by so-called restrictions upon movement or assembly. So I see a bigger role for the epistemic community of human rights experts. After writing the book chapter, we have worked with Helga Malmbeck-Stensing towards a structured assessment model where we have different baskets, human rights placed in different baskets. And then within those baskets, we have different items. And we are trying to mark and score and measure. And we have come to quite exciting results through a pilot study, which actually shows that it is possible to rank countries if you want, but more so to conduct a self-assessment. Are we complying with human rights? And we claim that deaths during COVID-19 should have a central place. Maybe the biggest mark would flow from deaths, but that's not the only one. You can also fail the test if you, for instance, introduce restrictions that are without legal basis and without an assessment of necessity and proportionality. So that's why we claim that human rights experts should be involved at all stages. Human rights are on both sides of the equation, and it's not a question of merely balancing between abstract values. It's about trying to have the evidence-based assessment. For instance, the proportionality test, which is important in human rights law, should be seen as a balance between the proven benefit towards delivering a legitimate aim and the proven harm to human rights. And it's clear that we need multidisciplinary assessment to measure the benefit and the harm, but we also need the framework of human rights law then to do the actual assessment. Where do those two competing lines meet? And how do you look simultaneously with multiple human rights of multiple population groups where they seemingly clash? It is a delicate exercise, and we claim that human rights experts should be at the table when those decisions are made. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Martin. So let me ask a follow-up. I mean, it's really fascinating to hear your description, almost like a kind of decision tree that countries could follow. But if the human rights approach is expanded into wider areas of governance, maybe COVID-19, but maybe others as well, do you see this approach as a way to stem the authoritarian and illiberal trends that have been strengthened, that we see have been strengthened around the world through and during the COVID-19 crisis?
Definitely, yes. In our chapter, we contrast human rights-based strategies against authoritarian populist approaches. Often those authoritarian populist approaches are quite uninformed, and they also can be acting in bad faith, in the sense that strengthening one's own rule or channeling funds into the pockets of one's family and friends are central in populist approaches to a pandemic. But even wider, I think it's not only populist authoritarian approaches that need to be contrasted, it's also technocratic regime, where, let's say, epidemiologists are in the driver's seat and apply their seemingly neutral rules, which are very strongly value-based. Or we have the, let's say, enlightened authoritarianism that has governed the world in the field of counterterrorism. Mind you, I was UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Counterterrorism, and there we saw how the UN Security Council took control and started to legislate for the world. We have also that scenario. They may be well-intended, but the result is not democratic, and it's not human rights compatible if you move decision-making to a higher body such as the UN Security Council. So I would say that an evidence-based, all things considering, human rights are on both sides of the equation approach is an alternative to populism, authoritarianism, technocratism, and undemocratic enlightened despotism. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Amanda, let me turn it over to you.
Great, thanks. And Katarina, will ask you next. We're looking forward to hearing your reflections also on thinking through a human rights-based approach in the pandemic context. So in your chapter, you argue for a human rights-based approach that's driven by solidarity, trust, and transparency, as opposed to driven by coercion or fear, an approach that's driven by those. And you make the point that human rights really elevates the responsibility of states and the collective responsibility as opposed to an individualized approach that we see a lot of times in health crises, including COVID, but also in others. So I'm hoping you can tell us a little more about how you see a human rights approach being applied in the health sector and what the steps would be to realizing that.
Thank you so much. So already back in 2000, the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights released its general comment on the right to health, which can be very instructive here and which I have obviously applied in the book chapter. And here they highlight some different principles which we should have regard to in the healthcare system. And these include that healthcare should be available, accessible, adequate, and of good quality. These are principles which we're pretty familiar with now, not that that means that they're actually enjoyed in practice, but beyond that, the committee also focuses on other principles which I want to highlight more here, and those would be non-discrimination, accountability, and participation. And I think we can all agree that non-discrimination has become a very central concern during the pandemic for good reason. And I think in my view, what's become quite clear is the limited means of accountability available to patients or would-be patients. So what I mean here is that perhaps we live in a state that recognizes the right to healthcare. But what happens if triage is full? What if you're in Britain right now and you're sitting in an ambulance outside the hospital emergency room for 12 hours waiting to get into hospital? And of course, what has become very starkly clear here is what if you live in a nursing home and you are suspected to have COVID or you are diagnosed with COVID, and staff decide consequentially not to take you to hospital and you have no means of contacting the hospital or getting there on your own. So what I'm trying to say is that the right to become a patient and the safeguards surrounding this, I believe, need to be explored in much greater detail in light of the experiences of this pandemic. And beyond this, there's a separate and connected issue, and that's how discrimination is built into healthcare. So for example, oximeters, some of you may have purchased them to measure your blood oxygen levels to determine when or if you should go to hospital if you have COVID-19. But what research has shown here is that the rates are different or can be different depending on your skin color. So for persons with darker skin, it's a different percentage of when you might be in danger. So research has shown that, for example, Black patients thought they were safe based on these readings and they were actually in danger. Just this Sunday, the Sunday Times in the UK has run an op-ed by the British Health Secretary, and he's announced, in light of the experiences of COVID-19, such as the one I just described, that he's commissioned an independent review to look at whether or the extent to which systematic bias exists within medical devices, and if so, how this can be addressed. So I think this is a really hopeful and an important step, even just acknowledging that these biases can be quite contentious. I've experienced at least in the past. And we also see that at EU level, with this proposed AI governance regulation, that there is also a recognition of how to address certain biases that we have seen in the pandemic. So in terms of steps forward, obviously one is setting up better accountability mechanisms where they exist or don't exist, so that these rights that are described in the general comments can actually be enforced and enjoyed, even by vulnerable or especially by the most vulnerable. I think another issue that needs to be addressed is corruption and underfinancing of healthcare. So without investing in healthcare systems or healthcare workers, I feel that real change is unlikely. And I think we saw also a lot of support for healthcare staff during the pandemic. And now when we're starting to talk about changing structures, better pay, better work conditions, this solidarity model is already waning. So, and then finally, I think something that's sort of in all our minds right now is the focus on vaccine mandates. So whether compulsory vaccines are in compliance or could be in compliance with human rights. So I think I'll leave it there.
Katerina, thanks. I really think the work that you did fleshing out the right to health and what it looks like in the pandemic is so valuable in the chapter. And I'm curious what you think, if steps were made to kind of looking forward to have a human rights-based approach adopted more widely in the health sector, do you imagine that having an impact in governance beyond health? Do you see any ties between the health reforms that you could call for and these authoritarian or liberal trends that we're seeing?
I think I'm slightly less hopeful than Martin, unfortunately. So I think that for human rights to have real governance impact, we need to see real change. So a good faith process that's actually open to change, not a piecemeal use of human rights, which is always the fear here. One really important aspect of human rights is participation. And this obviously means that individuals and groups should be involved in decision making. And I think if this were done effectively, of course, it could have a role in stemming these tides that you describe. But of course, there are big issues at stake here, such as power and resources. So for example, if you're living in poverty, or if you don't have childcare, or if you don't have sick pay, then participation can really just be an illusion. And right now, I think now that I see in the left-hand corner of my screen that we are apparently live on Facebook, it would be remiss not to mention, of course, the rapid spread of misinformation online and how that can drown out the technocrats who got a bit of a beating from Martin and scientific evidence. And as myself, an educator, and many of us are, I think we have a very important role there in actually teaching people how to evaluate sources, weigh them, weigh evidence, and critically reflect. And here again, human rights should also be part of that equation.
Great, thanks, Katerina. Martha?
Yes, thank you. So I want to just take a minute and remind people that we are going to turn to questions for the panelists after we hear their remarks. And so I just urge people to go ahead and start posting questions if you're interested, so that we'll be able to turn to them when we're opening up to that part of the discussion. So I'm happy to start the conversation with Claudia. Claudia, I think you were in Glasgow, am I right? That you attended the COP26, and so that's over, you know, and had some frustrations and disappointments, I know. And the post-2030 global biodiversity framework is expected to be adopted in the biodiversity COP15 next spring. So we've got lots of balls in the air. In the book, you argue that climate and biodiversity crises illustrate how people, ecosystems, and other living beings around the world are interconnected. And COVID-19, you know, of course, has made that link very obvious to folks. As debates on building forward fairer intensify, you assess whether COVID-19 is frustrating or facilitating the necessary sustainability transformations and demands for environmental justice. So, you know, it takes a long time to publish a book, and you wrote your chapter probably more than a year ago. And so now, a year later, do you still share the same assessment, or would you have written it differently now that COP26 is over?
Yeah, thank you, Marta. I think I have participated in various of the online events of the COP and the climate, and also in the biodiversity technical meetings that will lead to the adoption of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework that will be adopted in China. I think it's becoming clearer and clearer how a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is crucial for the enjoyment of human rights. We see, for example, that the research, both previous and new, shows the importance of buffer zones between where people live and where wildlife is prevalent. Because then if you don't have those buffer zones, there's an increased risk of pandemics in terms of these zoonotic diseases that are transmitted from animals to humans. And paradoxically, what we have seen is that instead, many of the states raising these environmental standards, we see many of them actually lowering that and doing that with a lack of accountability, which risks to frustrate societal transformations towards sustainability that have been highlighted, the urgent need within the context of the Convention of Biological Diversity, within the context of the Sustainable Development Goals. And we see that this is not only an abstract discussion, this is very real, and it's counted in lives of people. For instance, in the Amazon, illegal loggers and miners are not only coming now with the ecosystem degradation, but also with the spread of COVID. And we have heard about the many inequalities that come into place, for example, in terms of air pollution, which has not only confirmed, but also magnified the impacts, as high levels of air pollution and long exposures are correlated with a higher level of COVID mortality. We see the impacts of climate and how migration leads people to live in places which are not in suitable conditions, including places where there's not enough ventilation, being more susceptible to COVID-19. So here, human rights have a key role to play. And here, I'm thinking about these agreements at the global level, such as the Conference of the Parties that just ended. But I think the results of that also shows us that it's not only about how international law is kind of trickling down at the national and subnational level. I'd like to highlight the importance of a parallel process in which civil society organizations, national levels, regional mechanisms are influencing international law. And I think a very concrete example here is the recognition of the right to a healthy environment by the Human Rights Council, which just was adopted now in October and showed us that, yes, this resolution was adopted and negotiated by states. But there were more than 1,300 organizations, youth groups, women's groups, really calling for this recognition. So I think this combination with these global processes that, I mean, beyond declarations and pledges, we need this kind of work that is ground up as well. And I would just like to end the intervention of this importance of considering tipping points. Tipping points in the sense that prompt action can have exponential benefits. And using human rights law here, it's a vital issue. Not doing so and doing it late can have exponential negative effects. So we are at a critical point in a moment where we need this urgent action towards sustainability and these transformations.
Great, thank you, Claudia. So, a theme in our discussion today is the impact on democratic institutions and authoritarian trends. And so I want to ask you about what you see the connection between, the work that you're doing on sustainability is with those issues. And so in particular, we've talked about, and we all know about the very sort of committed social movement around sustainability and climate change. And then you just mentioned tipping points, and of course the social movements connect with that. How do you think these discussions around sustainability and global climate, can they strengthen democratic developments that counter authoritarian trends, or are they sort of just a parallel kind of event that's happening?
I think they're extremely interrelated. I mean, we have heard from the other speakers this importance of the principle of interdependence and indivisibility of human rights. I could add there, also we have this interdependence and indivisibility between human rights and environmental issues. And I think here, I mean, talking about human rights law, I think just as we see in terms of environmental issues and COVID, there is a lot of a narrative of fear and despair. Something that I would like to prompt human rights law and human rights scholars and practitioners is to try to open this frame, to also include empathy, solidarity, hope, and also by using the law to enact change. And we see youth, they are teaching us in many ways how to see this hope, not only by sitting down, but by acting. And here, I think in terms of what can we do? Well, we see many countries around the world that are taking their access to information, public participation, access to justice and litigation in terms of climate and biodiversity laws to their national courts and are having a positive results. So just as elder people are disproportionately affected by COVID-19, youth, future generations are disproportionately affected by the climate crisis, the biodiversity loss crisis, and the pollution crisis. So we urgently need to be thinking about how can we combine this international law with these ground-up approaches to really do things different and enact this transformation for sustainability.
Thank you, Claudia. Amanda?
Great, and Claudia, that's such a nice segue into the conversation on Morton's really important chapter of thinking forward and what this new agenda can look like. Of course, I know, Morton, when you wrote the chapter, you framed it as a post-COVID human rights agenda, which maybe already was optimistic, but I think definitely we're kind of moving through phases. And so I'm really glad that we have this chance to talk through your chapter. And I know that you wrote that chapter really drawing on the insights that you gain with your team, with RWI, working in so many different contexts on questions of inequality, all different kinds of authorities and the international human rights architecture. And so you have a really unique vantage point to be setting out this agenda and parameters for us. And so just hoping you'll tell us a little bit more of what you set out as those critical elements for local and global human rights agendas as we look forward.
Thank you very much, Amanda, and thanks for the previous three presentations. Great. Let me just, in the invitation, we mentioned the 2015 agenda. And what do we mean by that? We talk about the 2030 agenda, but we sort of also try to introduce the 2050 agenda. And that is basically linked to Claudia's presentation, 2015, the Paris Agreement, climate, as well as, of course, the SDGs. And the uniqueness of these two 2015 documents is, first of all, that they're global, they are human rights based, human rights framing, and in particular the SDGs, of course, they are holistic. So they actually create a very strong outset for the conversation that we have here today, and create a platform for where we are moving on forward. And I think when we talk SDGs or we talk climate, what is very often forgotten are the human rights dimension of it. So let me mention three elements that I think can contribute greatly to building forward fairer. And these are not new insights or new elements, but they are elements that have been exposed by the COVID-19 crisis, and where we may have an opportunity, and I really underscore may have, there are no guarantees here, but we may have an opportunity to create change in some of those, let's say, well-known issues in this post-COVID era, the coming years. What the COVID-19 crisis has shown us is that the old social contract has been broken, and we need to build a new one. And the three elements that I want to highlight here, there are many elements, but three elements in particular that I find of importance and written in my book. First, in his book, Black Earth, written by the American historian Timothy Snyder, he writes that freedom is not the absence of state. And I think it's just such a clear, important lesson learned. The many relatives to people who died from COVID-19 during the crisis due to lack of insufficient treatment, I'm sure will agree to the fact that a stronger and better functioning health care system would actually have been preferred. And of course, the same would go for the many kids that have missed valuable school education during these years due to the lack of resources to make a proper homeschooling or other sorts of schooling in this crisis. And this is all about the right to life, right to health, right to education. So the COVID-19 crisis has opened a floodgate of questions in relation to how the state in the future will be better in respecting, protecting, and fulfilling our rights. The many years of the neoliberal economic thinking has to be altered to address these issues. Cutting in public spending and privatizing key obligations of the state, such as fulfilling the right to health and education, has happened to the detriment of, in particular, the vulnerable people in our communities and also the economic disadvantaged groups. And as we have seen, we can read the death tolls, it has cost lives the past 2 years. So we have to build or rebuild social cohesion and trust in the public institutions, stronger institutions within a human rights framework. And here I would just make a small reference also to Katharina when she mentioned corruption, because definitely the rampant tax evasion and corruption has also been thrown at us. So what we see globally now in our programs, and I just came back from Chad yesterday, that there is really an alertness now that we haven't seen before to the need to address both tax evasion and in particular corruption. This leads me to the second element that other speakers have touched upon as well, because what should this human rights framework then be for the hopeful stronger institutions? Stronger institutions can be dangerous if they are not framed in has a human rights framework. So what does it look like? In the new social contract, it is indispensable that we see economic, social, and cultural rights interrelated and interconnected with civil and political rights. The right to health, as we have heard, is closely tied, of course, to the right to life, freedom of expression, and access to information, and numerous other rights. So an increased focus on economic social rights may also contribute to stronger support for human rights, for the Human Rights Project, since these rights are what really seriously occupy people in their everyday life. We have seen that in the social unrest prior to the COVID crisis, but also during the COVID crisis. In particular, I would point to the Chilean case, which is very interesting to study in this regard. The final and third point, the interrelatedness of all rights makes so much sense where people live. And where do they live? They live locally. They don't live in some sort of human rights bubble in Geneva or New York or somewhere else. They live very locally. And here, the old divide simply does not make sense in the day-to-day implementation of human rights at the very local level, when you are in a city, when you are in a region, or if you are very locally. And we now see more and more cities across all continents that are engaging in a more focused manner with human rights. They build it into their policies and strategies and apply a human rights-based approach to servicing the citizens in health and education, and all the other matters. It would be very interesting to see the result of those human rights-based hospitals that we know around the world, to see if we actually can detect the differences in the death tolls, as I think Martin pointed to as a key parameter for the success or lack of success. So the human rights city movement should definitely be supported in the time to come. Let me just mention here that the motivation for cities to deal with human rights or be more involved in the human rights agenda is first and foremost to create better and more livable cities, better places to live. But it's also a reaction to the new public management. We hear that time and again when we discuss it with cities. And certainly also a reaction to authoritarianism, populism, and basically some places dysfunctional national authorities. So these are some of the elements that I see building forward fairer and how we can contribute to a new social contract and give some more meat to the 2015 agenda. So thank you very much, Amanda.
Thanks, Martin. And we'll have time to get more reactions and conversation about those really important points. I wanted to ask one follow-up question. You mentioned in your chapter some of the critiques of the human rights field and framework, especially coming from scholars like Sam Moyn, about the failure of the human rights field to properly address and engage with questions of systemic inequality and poverty. And I also know, of course, that RWI has engaged in a new partnership under your leadership with the High Commissioner's Office to support the SURGE initiative, which is focused specifically on that, on bringing a human rights lens and frame to questions of economic policy and inequality. So I'm curious if you could share a little bit about that work, how it has maybe informed your thinking on these questions, and where you see, looking forward now, the relevance of the human rights agenda in COVID recovery.
Thank you. Yes, it's true that we have seen scholars like Samuel Moyn and others sort of critiquing the entire human rights project, the human rights system mechanism, because it has not sufficiently addressed economic social rights in the past. And I think the critique is rightly made. I don't think the conclusion is correct that you sort of dismiss human rights in their entirety because of, let's say, a failure to address sufficiently economic social rights. But the critique is being listened to, and it's definitely being picked up. And as you rightly say, we have just, I mean, the current High Commissioner for Human Rights has it as her main agenda is to upscale economic social rights, both in Geneva in the program as well as in the programming in the work in countries that technical assistance. And here we have engaged or are engaging with the Office of the High Commissioner in what is called the SURGE project, actually bringing in economists, simply to, again, coming back to, I think, again, Martin, you mentioned it, the evidence-based approach. We need to know more. What are these economic mechanisms? How do we use the economic mechanism? What does it cost? What is the cost of a minimum health service in a rural area in country X, Y, and Z? What is the minimum food package, etc.? And how can we then scale that up to the national level and thereby sort of say insist when we do human rights-based budgeting at the national level or regional or municipal level to ensure that those food packages or that level of health services can be delivered. So it's sort of, let's say, you could almost say a strong ammunition in the human rights dialogue, or a new tool in the human rights dialogue with governments and insistence on the realization of these rights. Because I know all human rights people are very often met by economic counter arguments. It's too expensive, or it cannot be realized within the means that that we have. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Martin. And I'd like to ask the participants, please do feel free to enter your questions in the Q&A. We will be really glad to turn to those. Before we do, I'd like to ask the panel if you have any either follow-up questions for your colleagues or responses to what you've heard. feel free to jump in, or else we could run down the order. Does anybody have a reaction? Claudia, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you all for really interesting interventions. My question is to Morten in terms of this social contract. And we know that the role of national human rights institutions, at least what we see in the environmental field, is that they are increasingly playing a very important role in bringing this evidence that what is happening really on the ground in terms of public inquiries and so on, in terms of bridging these right holders and duty bearers, national human rights institutions not being a part of the state, but yet mandated constitutionally. And yeah, so my question to Morten is, what role do you think national human rights institutions have in these building forward better and building forward fairer? Just at the sidelines of the recent climate conference of the parties, there was a meeting of a global meeting of national human rights institutions online to discuss, well, what will be their role in addressing this climate emergency. So yeah, I'm keen to hear from you and from other speakers as well. What do you think this role of national human rights institutions can be?
If I should start out, I think they're key actors in this. Some of them have been doing quite well. I can point to the South African Human Rights Commission as one, and I think also the Indian Human Rights Commission has done interesting work in this regard, as well as others. But as you could say, the entire human rights system in many ways have been very much focused, and you would say for good reasons, on civil political rights. So there is something to be picked up on how do you actually, let's say, transform the economic social rights into operational work for a national human rights institution working very specifically in a community. Because what I very often meet is that, well, we have a number of UN agencies and others working on education, on health and other issues. So it is done. What is then forgotten is that, yes, there may be, of course, there are other locally working in these areas, but they're not working from a human rights-based approach. And it's maybe exactly that human rights-based approach that may bring about the transformative change that is so much needed, that you identify, for example, those left behind. And not only look at sort of the general health system, the general education system, where you can actually penetrate much better and analyze much better the particular vulnerable groups. And there's a lot of, let's say, training needed and discussions to be had between national human rights institutions. And in particular, I think national human rights institutions should think in terms of being situated locally. I mean, they are unfortunately still very often based in very nice addresses in the capital of a country, not really reaching out to those most vulnerable, not really knowing sufficient about their specific situation, where we can see those who actually do have local presences, they have a different approach and much more accessible for people with their concerns, and their concerns very often being related to economic and social rights. So, but absolutely, it's a good point to raise.
Thanks, Morten. I wonder, Martin or Katarina, if you want to respond to that question or add a different question or reaction for your colleagues.
I think I'm going to pipe up, actually, even though I'm not on the panel, just to say, I'm glad that Morten brought up at the end there the importance of local human rights institutions. There are many of them in the United States. There's some in Canada, other places that have these subnational groups. And one thing that I think is important going forward is to make sure that they are not just viewing their agenda as civil rights, but really human rights as well. So I think there's a great opportunity there to really localize some of these things. I see that you're an actual panelist, so why don't you go ahead? Thank you.
I would also echo the emphasis on national human rights institutions, also because they have capacity to be genuinely multidisciplinary. Law is needed. I mean, human rights law is needed as a frame. But if we take an evidence-based approach, we need many other experts who look into the various dimensions. And I think COVID-19 is a very good case in point where we need the various medical fields of expertise, epidemiology, virology, public health, etc. But we also need sociologists, behavioral scientists, educational scientists, we need economists, we need political scientists. There's a wealth of different disciplines that need to be connected to the evidence-based assessments of the delivered benefit to a legitimate aim and of the human rights harm being caused. And a law faculty or a law-based human rights institution is not sufficient for that.
I just want to say I agree with what both have said. I think the thing that I think is a bit disheartening is that this was already clear with the 2015 Ebola pandemic or epidemic, where it became very clear that we need to involve, for example, anthropologists. We need people who understand a culture where an outbreak has happened, because people coming in hazmat suits without explanation, without understanding the practices and rituals of different communities is not an effective public health strategy. So this lesson should have been learned already, but I suppose because this pandemic has had more of a panicked response or more of a hasty response, it has still been overlooked. So I concur with the rest.
Great, thanks. We can keep the conversations and the questions coming, but I'll turn it over to Martha so we can take the questions that are starting to come in from participants.
Yes, great, thank you. So I urge, we've got a question here that I'll turn to in a minute, but I want to urge other folks to take advantage of this opportunity to engage in discussion with these really excellent thinkers and writers that we have here. So we've got a question here. It says many of the issues were not new, but COVID-19 put them in the public domain and generated more discussions on health and human rights, including discrimination, privacy, surveillance, all things that had been prominent or simmering in the past. And the question is, what has changed and how do we leverage this to ensure a human rights-based approach to health is achieved? Now, this is really a meta question. I want to emphasize the how, because I know people have identified that things have changed and perspectives changed. We have new information, but how do we do this? So let me open it to the floor, whoever wants to take that up.
I think first of all, I think the question is very well put, and I also sort of underscored it in my opening remarks that in many ways, I mean, these problems are old problems that we have seen, but they're just made so visible. I mentioned corruption in my short intervention, and definitely, I mean, when people cannot get access to oxygen or face masks or whatever it may be, because it has disappeared into a corrupt system, and it's so visible that it's corruption that led to this. That really makes people reflect, and it can be a powerful outset for change. Then what is the next step? I think the next step is to, in many ways, coming back to where we just came from on sort of the local, very local approach, seeing what, at least as one step, what happens locally? What happens here in region Skåne in southern Sweden, where I am right now? I mean, we are having a conversation in a group of the municipality, the Faculty of Medicine, some of the health services, hospitals, the pharmaceuticals, the municipalities, and others. I mean, sort of a small group of actors trying to analyze what happened. what could we have done better? Looking at the death tolls, I mean, if you look at the death tolls, I mean, that is a total read of the inequality of the Swedish community. It's person with mental health problems, it's or other disabilities, it's ethnic minorities, it's the economic disadvantaged, etc., etc. How could that happen? I mean, if the health system is sort of colorblind in terms of also economy and all sorts of differences, why do we then still see such let's say a different impact of the COVID crisis? And then, as I said earlier, there are some human rights-based hospitals. We have one in the neighborhood here that actually did a lot of what the others didn't, namely reaching actively out to those disadvantaged groups in the society to ensure that they got the information early on that came from the central health authorities, that it was communicated to persons with mental health problems, that it was translated into the local, to the languages for those who do not understand Swedish, but also a cultural translation, etc., etc. Together with the Office of the High Commissioner, we now being the Raoul Wallenberg Institute, we did a study in 15 countries to see what were the policies or the legislation and policies made. What really surprised us was that hardly any of the countries, I think Costa Rica was one of them, actually had in their emergency legislation written in that there is an obligation in times of emergencies to identify the most vulnerable groups. So you actually have an inventory of who will in particular be affected in this particular case. And then, of course, from there, have an active outreach. I mean, when I now talk around, speak with actors in various countries, I mean, very little has been done in that regard. So I think this is, let's say, one very specific starting point for going forward, is that our legislation, our preparedness is done differently, and that we get into our thinking that we need to look into who are the most vulnerable in our societies.
Great, thank you. Others want to weigh in?
I can follow on from that. So I think one issue that I've really noticed is, I suppose I graduated from university during the austerity crisis, which was sort of the big crisis I'm aware of, or the first big crisis that I remember at least. And I think at that time there was very much a focus on, well, we have a certain amount of money and this is what we can do. And I think with COVID, suddenly we've seen magic money come out of nowhere, and states suddenly investing in people. So pandemic payments, for example, if you're laid off work. So a sort of a bit of a social experiment in some countries, of course, about minimum income. So my point to this very good question is that I think governments can do more than we have been led to believe in these neoliberal policies that Morten has described previously. So this question of, or this answer to demands of, well, there's not resources to that, I think we need to keep pushing that and try to examine what resources are actually available and what means we have for gathering resources, because I'm sure Claudia has a good point here to make about how we can, use this momentum in relation to the climate emergency.
Great. Let me turn to Claudia, who has her hand up, and then to Martin. Is that all right, Claudia?
Yeah. I think, bringing the discussion also to the systemic approach to human rights issues that also Martin highlighted. I think when thinking about health, I think we, again, informed by this principle of interrelatedness and indivisibility, we need to be thinking about the connections also with a healthy environment more broadly. And I think it's extremely important to be looking at people in vulnerable situations. Yet I would like to kind of highlight that I do think that also we need a change in narrative on the human rights narrative, in the sense of often viewing people in vulnerable situations as passive victims. And as we have seen, and this really is illustrated very well in the human rights movement in connection with sustainability issue, is that women, children, youth are the ones, yes, they are vulnerable, but are also agents of change. And I think here the human rights-based approach also provides us with really key insights, in the sense that it's not a needs-based approach that we need. I think this human rights-based approach and empowerment and dignity really allows us to be putting a spotlight in this agency. And just, and also related to that, I think this narrative of catastrophe in certain parts of the world. I mean, I have lived many years in Latin America, I have lived in Africa, and I feel like when I'm outside those places, I get this narrative of complete despair and in the news and so on. And when you're there, you see a lot of changes, a lot of agency, a lot of positive, also, as Martin and others have highlighted, very locally driven initiatives that we need also a spotlight on that if we want these sustainability transformations. And as Martin said, these transformations more broadly.
You, Martin, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't want to repeat everything I've said, but I once again say human rights are on both sides of the equation, and I see transformative potential there. What is new is that human rights is not a minority opinion. We are quite used to seeing human rights criticisms of various measures taken by the authorities, but the prevailing view often is immigration is dealt by immigration authorities. They are the experts. Distribution is dealt by economists. They know what causes good economic results. Police deals with crime. Counter-terrorist experts deal with terrorism. And human rights people keep complaining and keep reminding that people also have human rights. This is a different situation, because we have so many competing human rights claims that human rights really must be in the center of all decision making here. We cannot comply at the same time with human rights claims from all sides. There must be a way to assess competing human rights claims as to their best compatibility with human rights. And this is new.
Great, thank you. So let me encourage folks who are online here to send in more questions. That's what we're here for. And you can use the chat or the Q&A. Either one is fine. I want to press Martin a little bit though on the this idea of using a matrix and evidence-based responses to issues. And one thing that we've seen, and maybe I'm particularly cognizant of it in the US, is rejection of evidence-based approaches. And so, how do we move beyond that, assuming I'm fully prepared to assume that your framework is a great way to proceed, but how do we get to a point that it's an accepted way of proceeding and making decisions?
Well, the easy part of the answer is that the current situation in the West is terrible, because the so-called experts have become highly defensive. That they are hiding the truth. They are denying, for instance, which non-medical interventions are best to protect us against COVID, because they have been proven wrong. So transparency and let's say multidisciplinarity, bringing everybody into the table is an antidote towards that kind of defensive, intransparent reactions. But it is also a power play that we have given too much authority to the technocratic decision making by assumed experts, so that many a government listens to a single source of authority, which is the government agency dealing with epidemics. And if they are evasive and intransparent and denying the truth, we are in trouble. And indeed, we are in big trouble in the West.
There are other
Martha, can I jump in with a
Amanda.
question?
Yep.
Sure. I'm just listening to everyone. I'm curious whether, a little bit thinking about the chapter that I worked on for the book, in the different spaces that you're tracking and working on, are you seeing the Sustainable Development Goals as a framework and the 2030 agenda, or even broader, like Martin said, the post-15 framework, which to some extent has supplanted a little bit human rights language in some cases? It's kind of fresh language, even though there's a lot of overlap of principles. So I'd be really curious to hear, when you're thinking about the transformations that we watch or the spaces that you're tracking, are you seeing the SDGs as something that is shepherding in positive change or the chance for a transformative recovery, or the opposite? I'd love to hear your reflections on that, if it's relevant to what you're watching.
Okay. No, thanks for that. I think that is a very important question, and I think we have in a way seen a change. I think there have been in the human rights environment, and they may see it somewhere, a reluctance and a skepticism in relation to the SDGs and the space that the SDGs have taken in a lot of the development work, as well as in general. I must say I see it, and also now, as I said, coming back from a number of missions, Zimbabwe, Chad, and other places, I definitely see something different. I see that the SDGs is, I mean, they're extremely well communicated, much better communicated than human rights ever were. So. And congratulations to all of those who did that. But I see that the linkage to human rights is generally being accepted, and it's being worked on. I mean, I wouldn't say that it's very advanced, but definitely the link to human rights is not generally something that scare people away from working with sort of that say, well, we are only working with the SDGs and not with human rights. I think there is a recognition that the two are interrelated, and that human rights are framing it, and you sort of add human rights dimension to the education, gender equality, poverty, and all the climate, whatever you find in the SDGs. I don't think there any longer is the same denial as we saw maybe in 16 and 17. There has been a change. So I really think if the human rights environment wants to, they can be an enormous door opener to create a stronger understanding of the link between, as the three elements of the UN: peace, development, and human rights. I mean, that is coming together. Let me just mention one example that we have looked into quite a bit, and that is to see this reform of the UN. The UN has sort of come together. Previously, it was the director of UNDP, sort of being the head of all the UN, or representing the UN at the country level or at the regional level. That has been changed in recent years by the current Secretary General. So now there are resident coordinators, basically a person appointed by the General Secretary General who is sort of above all the agencies. And these are, in many countries, actually much more open to discuss human rights than the previous UNDP directors. The UNDP has sort of always had a bit of schism, have had a problem with didn't quite know how to relate to human rights, but we now see that the resident coordinators and what the Office of the High Commissioner has done is to actually provide human rights advisors to the offices of the resident coordinators. So basically upscaling it quite a bit at that level. It's still early days, but I must say from sort of say a bit impressionistic. There are a lot of examples of where that has had quite an impact at the very local level. So things are happening, and in that intersection or interaction between the SDGs and human rights. So that's very much what I see as what we sort of had labeled the 2015 or the post-2015 agenda.
I'd like to also bring some perspective on that, on how the Sustainable Development Goals nexus with the human rights law. And I think it's important to look at the text of the Agenda 2030, that it explicitly refers that the Sustainable Development Goals are grounded in international law and international, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And here, what I think it's important is to the risk of not lowering the human rights standards, which are set by human rights law. And I think bearing that in mind, I think the synergies are really significant. And just to give you an example, in many of the international fora where I participate in terms of environmental agreements, when you bring the issue of human rights, and this relates to what was seen before, no, we're experts on biodiversity, or we're experts on climate change. Why should we be talking about human rights? And I think very concretely, what the Sustainable Development Goals have brought is the idea of this interrelatedness. Because as Agenda 2030 highlights, all the Sustainable Development Goals are interdependent and indivisible. So then you say, well, you do work with the Agenda 2030, right? And they, oh, of course we work with Agenda 2030. And then you say, well, then Agenda 2030 tells you that you need to be working with human rights. And then it becomes like a dialogue opener, I could say. And then, of course, there's a lot to do more in this ground. But I think both recognizing the risks, but also building up on these synergies, and SDG 16 on peace, justice, and strong institutions, although it surprisingly doesn't have any indicators or anything specifying environmental issues, I think it's at the core of bringing solutions also to the environmental crisis.
Any other comments on that? We have a couple questions that have come in from the folks online here. So let me turn to the first one here, which is question mostly in the context of COVID-19, but also thinking more broadly as well. And the question is, how do we manage exemptions and trump cards provided in law, depending on the interpretation, both used by governments in the health sector that often lead to undermining human rights, such as seeking consent for processing of data and unjustified arbitrary interference with the right to privacy. And so I'll be interested in what you think about that. I mean, it might you might argue that this is an example of human rights on both sides, I guess. So let me open it up to the group. Yeah, Katharina.
Hi, I'll respond to this because I am a researcher in health law as well as human rights. So I wouldn't call them exemptions, at least I'm coming at from the EU GDPR context, where consent is just one basis for processing health data. So there are other bases, legal bases for processing health data. Why? And is that illegitimate? I don't believe it is. What I do believe is important is that this word transparency, which can be, of course, a bit of a buzzword, but it's clear to patients or it's clear to individuals that their data may be processed without consent based on other legal bases and for what purposes this can happen. So if you think of in your interactions with the healthcare system, not every interaction is based on consent or can be based on consent to have an efficient healthcare system. So for example, your doctor making notes in your healthcare journal, should you have to give consent to this? Well, some people could argue yes, but of course it's necessary for the functioning of a healthcare system that a doctor can make notes, and that in some cases these notes can be shared. For example, if you're in a car accident and you're not able to give consent. So I think what's really key here is the awareness of how healthcare data can actually be used and for what purposes it can be used, and how to, for example, opt out of these purposes and avoid that. But I think in terms of surveillance, it's a really important issue that the pandemic has really brought to life. And I think brought a lot more awareness for how governments are surveilling people already. And I think that's only important. But I suppose I just want to sort of defend the healthcare system to a certain extent. And I think in the sort of the light of Martin's remarks about this sort of balances and both sides. For example, in sharing healthcare data, if I've been affected with COVID, but I don't want to tell my colleagues here at the faculty, should I be able to trump, should my right be able to trump? This word is just ruined for all eternity. I say no. Thanks.
I think we are in a tricky situation also because the framework of the law wasn't prepared for COVID. The framework for permissible limitations upon rights such as data protection or privacy is clear in human rights law. And I agree to what was just said by Katharina. But the problem is that in many countries, we don't have the legislation. And then the defensive mechanisms kick in. So that, for instance, the specialized government agency who's in charge realizes that we should have developed the legal tools and we haven't. So they easily say, we can't because of data protection. We can't because of privacy. But it's because we don't have the legislation in place. I'm sitting in Italy now, and Italy has solved this through a semi-permanent state of emergency, where new laws are continuously adopted through decree passed by the prime minister. I don't say it's an ideal system, but it just shows you that all that is required is quick processes for adopting new laws when we have new circumstances. And I think COVID has been a
Oh, no, it looks like Martin froze
real test case.
There you are. Sorry,
for the
Martin, you
framework.
froze for a second. So
Okay,
now you're back. Thank you.
I'll jump forward. It's disheartening to see how legislative processes don't work in many Western countries at the pace that is required by, let's say, waning vaccines and new information about modes of transmission, airborne transmission being prevalent. Parliament may be on holidays, and there's a constitutional convention not to call them back unless there is a war. So we are in situations where it would be easy to fix the gaps in the law, but that's not done.
Thank you. Any other comments on that question? Amanda, you said that you have another question. Can I turn it over to you?
Sure, sorry to jump in again. I'm curious, as I sit here and calling in from Minneapolis, a lot of our conversations around the pandemic and openings for systemic change are kind of layered on top of the racial justice protests that were spurred by the killing of George Floyd here. And same in Latin America, the context seems to be really connected to unrest and protest on the streets about economic social rights. So I'm curious if that's the same experience, kind of speaking from Europe. Do you find those contexts influencing how we think about whether the pandemic is creating openings, or any thoughts you have on the connection between those events and our consideration of how we recover and move forward from this phase?
Okay. No, I I think there's as far as I understand you ask if there's sort of a spillover from the US to elsewhere, and I think there's been a major spillover. I think there is what sort of happened in the US and the discussions after George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement has opened up. There have been attempts in many European countries, some successful, other places less successful, in sort of having the immigrant blaming approach on in relation to foreigners. And it's of course still early days, but I would say that there have been more reactions against it than it has actually picked up. I think people have sort of realized that, whoa, this is not the time. We can do the Muslim and immigrant bashing later at another stage, but now we are occupied with the COVID. So, and also that each time they sort of they blame, for example, if there was a flaming up of COVID in the country, and they immediately sort of referred to the immigrant communities. Then in media and elsewhere say, well, this is not only an immigrant, it's also in other communities. And now with the people not being vaccinated, it's in the immigrant communities. No, it's also definitely in other communities. So there are, let's say, it's coming in, and I think a lot of it was sort of creating the sensitivities from the US, a spillover in relation to those. To sort of the discrimination, also in terms, again, coming back to what I said earlier on the death tolls, that what we see is that a lot of, let's say, people with ethnic minority background are among the persons that died, and there've been a lot of sort of, it's because they are like, it's their culture, it's their religion, but then other voices have appeared saying, sorry, no, I mean, look at who is in the frontline jobs, who the size of apartments, etc. It is maybe more a social issue, an employment issue, and things like that. So, but again, I said it's early days, but I think there is something positive, hopeful to build on here.
Wow, you really are an optimist one. I'm a little less optimistic. I think European countries probably need to have their own reckoning with these questions. I think, yes, it has spurred some discussions and debates, but I think there also needs to be a European contextualized kind of discussion, because I think quite often the risk is, well, that's the US context, and of course the US context is very unique, given the near history of slavery and Jim Crow, but of course there, so I just think there needs to be a European discussion, and I think unfortunately the problem becomes again about power. Most of us, or hopefully all of us, can agree that racism is wrong and bad. But then when it comes to actually transferring power through resources or other means, that's when there's a lot of pushback. Here in Denmark, I'll just stop with a quick example. We had some Black Lives Matter protests in the summer. I think in the beginning, this was received okay. And then a media story was really pushed about the organizer had said that Black people should be at the front of the march, and white people should not take up those positions. That seems like a not very exciting request to me. This was all over the media, Facebook, whatever, for weeks, and became really a focal point. Instead of actually talking about the issues at hand and changing things, it becomes a focus about who gets to stand where and how those people felt that they were subject to racism. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, but I was also encouraged by this planned investigation that I mentioned in the UK. Thanks.
If I can just add to this, Amanda, sort of broadening the vulnerable groups to persons in care institutions. I think another chapter, and we have also discussed it in previous webinars, but I just want to mention it. I think there will be another discussion that will come up is how do we actually deal with people, I mean, persons with disabilities, our elderly, etc. And I think in particular, the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disability, Gerald Quinn, has in the book a very powerful article on basically where he calls for a dismantling of the institutions, that this has sort of proven that the institutions, at least as they are organized today, simply cannot live up to their responsibilities to offer the protection that the persons in their care can rightly expect from the. I've seen instructions from head of institutions coming back to, I think what you raised, Katharina, on the triage, or basically saying that persons in elder care homes who attract corona should not be referred to a doctor, but should be referred to palliative care. Basically mean let them die. And this is here in Sweden. And we have the case from, I think, Pennsylvania, where actually a judge turned a triage like that down and said you have to make the individual assessment of each case. You cannot just make a general policy of that this group should not receive mental health. So I really liked what you mentioned, Katharina, the right to be treated, the right to become a patient. It's interesting.
So let me, we only have time for a few more comments, but we do have a series of questions that have come in here, particularly about Poland and the question of whether or not there were any particular human rights issues that came up in Poland during COVID-19. Let me just open it up to anyone who wants to respond either about Poland or other examples of either good practices or things that we should be concerned about. Just take a few seconds, each of you, if you'd like to share that before the end of the webinar. Claudia?
Well, more in terms of more general reflections and this issue of spillover, I think something that has happened in terms of the human rights and environment nexus is that there is an increasing recognition of national courts getting inspired of what's happening in other national jurisdictions. And I think that's really positive when it comes to progressing interpretation of human rights and its nexus to a healthy environment and how vulnerable people in vulnerable situations, including these, how to address challenges in terms of the shrinking civil space. So I could encourage also, it's more common that, say, Latin American countries or African countries refer to European countries, these innovative interpretations. I would like to encourage that it's also the other way around, because there are very innovative interpretations going on in Africa, Latin America that we can learn from, and the same from regional systems, the European system of human rights and the Inter-American Court of Human Rights and others. So really encourage this cross-fertilization between national jurisdictions and also at the regional level to inform these global processes as well.
That's great, thank you. Anyone else? Last few seconds. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and close this out. I really appreciate the the participants and the panelists for their insights today and for their contributions to the book as well. COVID-19, I'll show it here, COVID-19 and Human Rights there. And this is, as Amanda mentioned at the outset, this is the 4th webinar that we've hosted on COVID-19 and human rights. And of course, when we started, we thought we'd be done with COVID-19 and human rights by now, but there's much more to talk about. So I think we've all appreciated, especially today, the chance to talk in depth about the human rights implications of the challenges that we're facing that have been exacerbated by the pandemic. And this series has given us space to connect the dots between the front and center health implications of COVID and the other issues that we've addressed in this series: environmental issues, housing, water, food, and then today turning to the significant impacts on politics worldwide and thinking about how to build back fairer. So a heartfelt thank you from the sponsors of this webinar, and to any US residents that are on Zoom. Happy Thanksgiving. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Take care.